Welcome, guys, back to the Grateful Living podcast. Today, I am honored to have Sherrod Blakely. Sherrod is the Celtics Insider at NBC Sports Boston and has been since 2009. Sherrod, thank you for being on.
Good to be here. Good to be here.
Thank you. So let's go back to the beginning. Can you go back to maybe where you grew up? Your family situation, and the time period, that you grew up in.
Yeah, I grew up in Syracuse, New York, and the 70s, 80s was kind of the period where I was kind of coming of age, and I did the same thing most kids did. I played football, basketball, baseball in the streets, hung out with friends, played video games, had baseball cards, basketball cards, all that. I'm kind of kicking myself for not holding on to the Michael Jordan cards I had. Those would have been real handy when it came time to pay for kids to go to college.
Yeah.
But it was a pretty typical, childhood. I loved sports. I knew at an early age that was something that I wanted to be involved with. I didn't have the dreams that a lot of my friends did about wanting to be an NBA player or an NFL player. I just wanted to play the game. I didn't think about levels of play. I just wanted to keep playing. And so that was kind of my attitude pretty much up until high school, where that's when it became an issue. That's when it became something I had to give a little bit more thought to if I wanted to, just let this end at high school, or was there a possibility of doing something beyond that? And at the same time, I knew that no matter what I did, I had to have a pretty decent academic background. My mom, her big thing was you're not going to play sports unless you have at least a B.
Yeah.
There's no ball, no football, no baseball, no basketball unless I see some B's in the classroom.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the focus for most of my middle school, high school years, was just to be a good student. And not really thinking a whole lot about it, kind of the way I approach sports, that opened up some doors that I just did not anticipate. I wound up going to Syracuse University on a full academic scholarship, which was a little bit surprising to me because that wasn't something that I was 100% locked in on. But I studied journalism at the SI Newhouse School of Communications, and it was basically a 10th grade English teacher who gave us an assignment to do one weekend. And it was just write about something you did. And I wrote about a football game between the Miami Dolphins and the Pittsburgh Steelers. I remember it vividly because it was like literally the first byline, if you will, I had. And I turned the paper in. And at that time, I hated writing.
Yeah.
I hated English. I hated anything that didn't involve numbers, because my focus at that point as a youngster, I wanted to be an engineer. I had my focus on being a chemical engineer.
Yeah.
And most of what I did academically in high school was geared towards the engineering field. My chemistry teacher, I aced that class. And when I say aced, I mean, I got 100 in the class.
Yeah.
And so that opened up some opportunities where I did an internship at a local hospital, and I was one of 3 people chosen in the entire state of New York to do one of these internships. And I studied pathology, where I examined different cancerous tissue cells. And so I'm in a lab coat with my little Petri dish, and I'm jotting down all this data every single day. And I realized about maybe halfway through that internship that, God, this is not what I meant to do.
Oh, okay.
This is playing to what my strengths were, which were math and sciences and all that, but it was just so ridiculously boring to me. And I knew that it was, I knew that what I was doing was for a good cause. I mean, studying cancerous tissue cells, I think anyone who is involved in any of the work in that field is just awesome. And certainly, cancer, which was something that had affected my family significantly, I felt really honored to have an opportunity to kind of help in that whole process of searching out a cure and researching it. But the level of boredom that I was dealing with on a day in, day out basis was painful. And so then I started thinking, well, maybe that my English teacher, who thought I did a really good job on that paper last year, maybe I need to think about journalism. And I took a class that at the end of the class, they awarded one student a full ride to Syracuse University. And so my thinking was, well, yeah, it'll be cool to take the class. And I remember the first day I took the class, and I'm looking around the room, and I felt pretty good about my chances of being the chosen one.
Yeah.
And I approached that the same way I approached classes, the same way I approach football. I just want to be the best version of myself. And that's the thing that I've always told people. You know, when you're looking for motivation, inspiration, first person you need to start with is the person you see in the mirror.
Yeah.
Because that's the person that ultimately is going to dictate how high or how low you go.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was always about just how can I be better? What can I do to be better at my craft? And you know, it's one of the few things in life where I think you do need to be a little selfish about your time and about your energy and your efforts. You should always be looking to improve yourself, whether you are a journalist, whether you're a chemist, whether you're cleaning up office buildings after hours. How can you be the best version of yourself every day? And understand that, no one said this thing called life was going to be a smooth ride down the Autobahn. It's just not like that. There are going to be bumps in the road. There are going to be setbacks. I don't really get all that caught up in setbacks as much as I focus on what's next. Because ultimately, that's what we're judged on. We're not necessarily judged on what we've done in the past, but what are we doing now, and can we do going forward? And so that mindset has served me well. I went to Syracuse University, graduated in 4 years, had a job starting off in Syracuse, and you're covering everything under the sun. I did everything from
a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that internship in chemistry or whatever, when was that?
That was 19.
Like that was high school or that was college?
It was high school.
Oh, okay.
It was high school.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then
go ahead.
No, but so at that point, when had you decided, okay, like I'm going to Syracuse for journalism, or were you still undecided going into?
I was still. I mean, to be frank with you, I didn't make the decision to go to Syracuse until they offered me a full ride to go to Syracuse.
Yeah.
Every other school that I was applying to and that I had interest in, it was going to be a science-based major. Syracuse was the only journalism option I was given serious thought, just because it was something that I was being told I was pretty good at, and it was something that I had a certain level of interest in, but I still felt that chemistry, engineering, that's kind of where my focus was. I was really interested in looking at just different ways of inventing various and this is, I mean, full disclosure, as a kid I really liked to mix soda flavors. And that was really when I found out that was an element of chemistry, and I'm just like, you know what, I can do this, because I can frankly get through a lot of the mundane chemical compositions and composing and all that other stuff, stoichiometry equations and things like that. I can work with all that. But can I have some fun doing that stuff? That was really why chemical engineering was something that I was really interested in. And my dad, he worked at New York Tel, and he was involved in a lot of circuitry and just putting together wires, building like little toy robots, things like that. And so that was something that was, kind of part of my childhood. That was something that I was very interested in. So, Syracuse, it was journalism or bust at Syracuse. That was the only school that I was seriously considering to go to school and study journalism.
So did you started out freshman year taking a journalism class? Or Okay.
Yeah. When I went to my major at Syracuse was newspaper journalism. That was my major from the beginning until the very end. And it's kind of funny because Syracuse, as most people know, is very big on broadcast journalism. And being a newspaper major, we had a lot of biases against the broadcast people. We just thought that they just read teleprompters and they don't write anything, and they're just a bunch of pretty boys and pretty girls up there. But as I found in time after I left Syracuse, there's so much more to the broadcast game, which I completely, if I don't have regrets about anything I've done, but if there's one thing I would probably do a little bit differently, I would definitely spend a little bit more time in understanding the broadcast journalism game when I was in undergrad. Because there's so much I learned afterwards that in hindsight, it would have definitely made my transition to doing TV a lot smoother.
So Did you have any interaction with like Jim Boeheim or anything like that at your?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, well, the other thing too, and just, I grew up, as I mentioned earlier, I grew up in Syracuse. And so,
Yeah.
Boeheim, back then, it would not have been unusual to run into him out and about in the streets. I remember vividly
Wow.
going to a Blockbuster, which for those who don't know, Blockbuster used to be where you could rent movies before you can just, from the seat of your home,
Yeah.
rent movies.
Yeah.
You actually physically went to a building and actually rented movies out that way. But I would run into him a couple times there. And we would exchange pleasantries. But as far as professionally speaking, our paths crossed just because when I worked at the Post Standard newspaper in Syracuse, New York,
Yeah.
I was backup Syracuse basketball, backup Syracuse football. I backed up the entire planet of Syracuse sports back then. And so
That was your first job after you graduated?
yeah, that was my first job out of college.
Yeah.
And so our paths would cross that way. And actually, one of my most fond memories was sitting in Boeheim's office with an interview that I had set up with him several weeks in advance. And it was also the day that a player that I don't know if most people remember, named Donald Foyle, who spent a lot of years playing for the Golden State Warriors.
Yeah.
Well, he played at nearby Colgate University
Yeah.
in college, but he was also from the area. And long story short, Colgate got a commitment from him over Syracuse, and I was in Boeheim's office the day he found out that O'Donnell was going to Colgate and not Syracuse.
Yeah.
And so that interview that I was really geeked about got canceled. Boeheim was not in the mood to talk that day.
Yeah.
So, but Boeheim, he's always been someone that I've had a lot of respect for, just because as a Syracuse alum and as a college basketball fan, I like the consistency that I'm going to get with Boeheim. They're going to win 20 games pretty much every year.
Yeah.
They'll get to the first or second round of the tournament, every year. They'll get to the Final Four every decade. They'll win a championship, once every 20, 30 years. I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Totally okay with that.
Yeah. I'm a Boston College Eagle fan, so
Ooh.
we would be definitely okay with that. So talk to me about those early days at the Post Standard, and what that was like. What was your first position there, and things like that?
Well, I was a general assignment reporter. That was my official title. But I mean, realistically, you're covering everything from basketball to blacksmithing. And yes, there is such a thing as blacksmithing contests, which I have covered.
Yeah.
So you just have to be versatile, flexible, and understand that, as much as you want to kind of go to that next level journalistically, when you're starting off, you're just trying to get your traction. You're just trying to figure out how you can really be the best version of yourself, which you will hear me talk about a lot,
Yeah.
because that really is kind of the mantra that I've lived by for a number of years. And so those early years, I was willing to do anything and everything they asked me to do.
Yeah.
And that's the one thing that's a little bit different than I think some of the more recent journalists out there. They have a very specific thing they want to do. They have a very specific style that they want to present themselves with. And I think that a lot of times they're hurting themselves more than they're helping themselves, because they're not open to the process of just potentially finding themselves pivoting in a career path that they may not have even given any thought to.
Yeah.
I never had any dreams of ever covering the NBA. It was something that was never on my radar. My goal was to cover a major college basketball and football program. That was like the be all end all. The problem for me was that long-term down the road dream that I had, I was actually doing that when I was 23 years old. When I left the Post Standard and I went to North Carolina, and I was covering ACC football and basketball, NC State and Duke.
Yeah.
So
how long were you at the Post Standard?
I interned there throughout college, and I spent another year and a half after graduation there.
Okay.
And again, and when I was there, I did all that stuff that I mentioned, just kind of backing up all the sports. My last, I'd say half year there, I was covering Syracuse lacrosse, which was awesome. I love lacrosse. And so it was really cool to kind of, get that under my belt. And the funny thing about it is, it seems that whenever I cover a team and I leave, that team does great things. When I left Syracuse, the lacrosse team, I think they won a national championship that year.
Okay.
When I left North Carolina, I was covering Duke. They won a national championship the year I left. So I guess I'm the good luck charm that gives on the way out the door. So.
Yeah. How was moving to North Carolina versus Syracuse, New York? Was that a big culture difference?
It was in many respects, only because, growing up in Syracuse, I'm a Northeast guy, spent my entire life in this part of the country, and going from there to the South is different.
Yeah.
There were some without question, I had concerns going in. I did not know what the temperature would be from a racial standpoint, for me being so far, not so much far away from home, but being in that part of the country. And it was a bit of a culture shock at first.
Yeah.
Racism is real. I mean, I know it's a taboo topic that a lot of people don't feel comfortable talking about, but it's real.
Yeah.
And it's something that on some levels I experienced in North Carolina. And it just depends. Ultimately, it comes down, how do you handle the adversity? Because everything you do, whether it's racism, whether it's the job, whether it's relationships, you're going to deal with some level of adversity. And it's not necessarily whether it's going to happen, but how are you going to deal with it when it does happen?
How are you going to handle it?
I had a lot of good people in North Carolina who really, they really helped that transition for me to kind of not necessarily accept the way things were, but to adapt and deal with them in a way that wouldn't be detrimental to me, while at the same time, allowing me to make it clear how I felt about certain things happening. So it was a good experience in North Carolina. It was really, to the point where I would, without question, move back to North Carolina. I mean, it's, I think when I do retire someday, that's where I will wind up, just because the positive experiences that I had down there far outweighed the negative. And for me, little things mean a lot. Like, my birthday's in November, and to be sitting on a porch drinking sweet tea on my birthday in flip-flops and a t-shirt, that's kind of a cool thing.
This is
Something I'm not
Boston.
Right. That's something I've never done in Boston, never done in Syracuse, and I don't think I ever will do those things at these places. But it's, again, all the life experiences that I've had have really kind of helped shape not only just where I'm at, but also just how I view things and view people and view situations.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about, so this was early 90s, correct?
Yes.
Talk a little bit about what it was like to be a minority reporter back then. I mean, obviously, for young folks now, it's not very uncommon to see, African-American reporters. But at that time, I'm sure Michael Wilbon was probably pretty significant. I mean, who else? Did you have mentors?
Well, it's funny because when I was first starting off in Syracuse, covering high schools, it didn't dawn on me just how unusual it was for me to be a Black sports reporter. I would go to high school games, and I would be the only, print reporter there. So to me, it didn't seem unusual. So it wasn't like I had this, it's me and there's all these other white reporters. I just didn't see them. Now, when I got to North Carolina, that's when it really became something that I gave a lot more thought about, because it was in my face. I'll never forget my very first ACC men's basketball tournament. And what they do is they put all the media in Greensboro Coliseum. And I just remember going to my media seat, taking a seat and looking around. And there was, other than the 7 or 8 guys on the court who looked kind of like me, there was only one other reporter in the stands that was a person of color. And there must have been at least 150, 200 people easily seated there. And so for me, that's when it really hit home, and just like a ton of bricks, that, wow, what I'm doing is unusual. And so that's, from that moment on, it really became something I gave a lot more thought to. And it's one of the reasons why I'm such a huge advocate for more diversity in news. I've been that way for more than 25 years. One of the things I do in addition to my NBC Sports job is I'm also the chair / president, if you will, of the National Association of Black Journalists Sports Task Force. In a nutshell, I it's the largest group of sports journalists of color in the entire world, and I'm kind of like their president.
Wow.
And so I take with tremendous honor and pride that position, but it also has a lot of responsibility.
Yeah.
And that responsibility is something that, again, I go back to that day in Greensboro, North Carolina, at the ACC tournament, seeing just such a overwhelming lack of color.
Yeah.
I've been just really crafting my career to just be more diverse. And the one thing, and this will be my last point on this. The one thing that I think is often, I think it's one of the misconceptions when you talk about diversity, is that it's just for people of color, and it's not. Diversity has to be an all-in proposition. You can't have a successful diversity program if everyone is Black, female, Native American, Indian, whatever.
Yeah.
White people, you have to be part of the solution as well. Yep. And so there are a lot of people that I've mentored through the years who are white, and I've never turned away someone because of their color, because for me, it's very difficult to preach diversity if you don't practice it. Yeah. And so that for me, that's why, diversity, it's been an issue that I have been championed for a long time, and I've never really had any issues because, again, what I preach about diversity, I practice.
Yeah. Did you, were you able to access any mentors at that time? There were people like Rob Parker, for example, who a lot of people know and a lot of people in Boston hate. He was one of my first mentors. As I got a little bit older and just started really kind of moving up the ladder, if you will, David Aldridge became just, I call him Uncle David. Yep. Because that's what he's meant to me. When I first got to the NBA, I remember he did when I was in Detroit, and we can talk about that a little bit later. Yeah. But when I was in Detroit, he was doing a national TV game, and he saw me in the press room, and he said, "Hey, how's it going? My name's David Aldridge." And I'm thinking, like, duh, like I wouldn't know who David Aldridge is. Yeah. And we struck up a conversation, and he made just the absolute mistake of all mistakes. He gave me his number and said, "If you need anything, give me a call." Yeah. Why did he do that? I called him pretty regularly for about a good 2.5, 3 weeks. Wow. And it was I think back to some of the stuff NBC
I asked him.
Or ESPN? Where was he at that time?
David I believe he was at ESPN then. This was like this was like 2000. This was around 2000. Yeah. I believe he was at either ESPN or Turner then, but he was still doing the multi-platform stuff. He was still writing, doing TV, sideline reporting. He was just, he was the blueprint that ultimately I would try to model myself after down the road. Yep. But he offered himself, someone I could lean on, and I leaned heavily on him those first few weeks I was covering the NBA. And that's one of the things I do like about the network of mentors that I have. The one thing that, they stressed to me was that at some point, what I'm doing for you, you have to do for others. And that's why as much as I am proud of, my mentors and what they've meant to me, I'm even more proud of my mentees. I've mentees in lots of different areas of journalism. And the thing I will say this is that I don't necessarily agree with everything my mentees do. Yeah. I don't necessarily agree with every position they take, or even most of their positions in some cases, but that never prevented me from giving them what I felt were some of the basic fundamentals that they would need in order to figure out who they were, in order to figure out which lane of journalism was best for them. And that I take a lot of pride in some of the young folks that I've been able to help figure out who they are and help them become the best version of themselves.
Yeah. At North Carolina, the coaches at that time were, was
Mac Brown. Yeah, Mac Brown was coaching UNC. Okay. North Carolina State was coached by Mike O'Kane. Okay. And Duke doesn't even matter because at that point they had just a coaching carousel. They were a horrible team. Yeah. It didn't matter who was coaching the team. They weren't going to win.
Oh, you were covering football, not basketball?
I covered both. Oh, okay. Basketball at North Carolina State, it was Herb Sendak. Okay. UNC, it was Dean Smith's longtime assistant. His name is What's that? No, he was before Williams. His name is escaping me now.
Yeah.
Because it's been a really long time, and I didn't really cover them that much. I covered the conference as a whole in North Carolina State specifically, and Duke specifically. I never covered UNC on a day in day out basis. So that was a good experience, though. I mean, just that to me, that was the utopia of college basketball. I mean, I was down there when Vince Carter, and I tease Vince about that now. I need him to stay in the league as long as possible because he's the last guy still in the NBA that I covered at some point in college.
Yeah.
But I got there like right after Rasheed Wallace and Jerry Stackhouse had left. But Vince Carter was still there. Antoine Jameson was still there. Those were, two of the bigger name players in the ACC at that point.
Yeah. Sounds good. And then, so from North Carolina, you moved to Detroit, correct?
Yeah.
For mlive.com.
For mlive.com. Yep.
Talk about your role there.
Well, that was interesting because at the time that MLive we had made contact and began talking, to me it was basically there's nothing to lose by talking with them because at the time I was covering Duke basketball, and I knew Duke basketball that particular year. That was 2000.
Okay.
They were going to be really good. Yeah. They were going to be really good. Shane Battier and I had lots of different conversations about that team, and he was someone that I had really gotten to know a little bit. And when I left to go to Michigan, and Shane Battier, for those who don't know, is also from the state of Michigan. Yeah. I remember his parting words were something to the effect that, too bad you're leaving now. You're going to miss all the fun in the championship. And Shane, you were right. Yeah. And him and I, we've joked about that since then. But the chance to go to Michigan was just something that it just proved to be too good to pass up for a lot of personal reasons. In addition to MLive being, I thought when I looked into their website, back then, websites did not have the proliferation that they have now. It just wasn't as big a deal. But I knew that was the direction our industry was going, and I knew that they had invested heavily in that to the point where the two Detroit papers, the Free Press and the News, were so far behind them from a digital imprint standpoint that I knew jumping on with MLive, I was going to be riding a wave that the rest of those papers were going to be trying to catch up with later. And that proved to be correct.
Yeah.
But MLive also had an affiliation with a bunch of newspapers throughout the state of Michigan. And those newspapers were owned by the Newhouse family. And as I had mentioned earlier, I attended Syracuse University, and their communication school is the S.I. Newhouse School of Communications. Yeah. And I was very familiar with how they operated back then, and it was very, I would say, employee friendly. The money was good, the benefits were great, and with me having a wife and two small kids, it made sense. Plus, it brought us a little bit closer to our families in upstate New York. So the money, the opportunity, the company, the website, I mean, everything just aligned itself to where going there was a no-brainer. Yeah. And I just remember some of the folks in North Carolina who knew I was leaving Duke just were kind of scratching their heads like, why would you go to Michigan to cover a crappy Detroit Pistons team? Yeah. And you would be writing on this website stuff? What's and they just didn't get it that, I'm not focused on the moment. I'm focusing on what's next. And they are already, and by them, I mean MLive, we're already focused on the next. And I wanted to be part of that. Yeah. And so it worked out great. I had a great time there. It was very hard to leave, to be frank with you. And I just don't know if, as most people remember, 2008, 2009 was when the economy really, really sucked. Yeah. Not as bad as it is right now, but it was pretty bad. Yeah. And Michigan got hit harder than a lot of areas because so much of their infrastructure was in cars. Yeah. And so when that, when that particular field dried up significantly, it led to a domino effect throughout the state and throughout newspapers and throughout digital properties. I remember, being told that, we kind of had a choice. I mean, either get laid off or take a 10% pay cut. Yeah. And, you take that pay cut. You're not happy about it, but, you're still going to be able to pay most of your bills, hopefully.
Yeah.
And so, that if that economic downturn hadn't happened, I don't know if I would have left Michigan.
Yeah.
Because the opportunity to come to Boston, it came with a great opportunity, great franchise, and it was similar from a mindset standpoint to what I was thinking when I was in North Carolina and I left for Michigan. This is the next step. This is what our business is doing now.
Yeah.
This is how they're progressing.
Yeah.
At the time,
before you go there, what were you were covering the Detroit Pistons in them live? How was that? I mean, how was that? That was at a time when they made the Eastern Conference Finals 6 years in a row, right? So how was that?
Well, the first year was tough because you have to keep in mind that at that time I came from the college world, and you've got 11 to 12 football games, then you transition to basketball. On a good year, you might get 35 games maybe. So you're looking at a season in which you're covering maybe 45, 46 games. We'll just say 50 if you throw in preseason games.
Yeah.
NBA, 82 game schedule. And the games, they come so quick. And that was the biggest challenge that first year, was just really just figuring out a pace that I could do my job at that doesn't kill me. Because, when you've got college football, you've got your schedule kind of laid out for the week. The game is at the end of the week, and you've got all these different things that you're doing to build up to that. And when you get to basketball season, you still have some spaced out time because these athlete students, because I don't like the notion of student athletes, they're really athlete students.
Yeah.
They still have to go to class, and they have to account for that when they're scheduling out the basketball schedule. So you have some breaks in there. But in the NBA, grown men, they don't need those. You can have games where you're playing 3 games in 4 nights, 4 games in 6 nights, 7 games in 10 days. Road trips where you're out of town for week and a half. Which is not conducive with having a 2-year-old and a 6-month-old, but that's another story.
Yeah.
But it was an adjustment. I mean, there's no question about it. And that first year for me was really, really rough. But once I got to the off season, had a chance to kind of take a deep breath, assess what worked, what didn't work. From year 2 going forward, man, it was great. I mean, just a blast.
That was Larry Brown?
No, my first year, the coach was George Irvin. They won, I think, maybe they were 32-50 that year. And Duke basketball won more games that year. But the second year, they brought in Rick Carlisle.
Okay.
And then Rick was there for a couple years and got them to the Eastern Conference Finals. Then Larry came in, and that started this run, or that started, I should say, that was the second. Rick Carlisle's last year, they got to the conference finals, and that was the first of that long run of conference finals or NBA finals.
Yeah.
That was like 2002.
Yeah. How was, were you there at the Malice game, or Malice at the Palace?
I knew that was coming.
I'm sorry.
It comes every single conversation for the last 20 or so, however many years it's been, when I talk about Detroit. Yes, I was there. Yes, I was on press row. And it was just the most surreal thing I've ever experienced then, and really, frank, to this day.
Yeah.
I always heard people talk about how certain events, when they're happening, they feel like they're going in slow motion. And I always thought that was just a bunch of BS. There's just that's not real. It's real.
Yeah.
Because I remember vividly seeing Ron Artest coming behind press row, running in my direction, and I'm looking at him, and I couldn't move. Because to me it was like, there's no way this is happening. There's no way this is happening. And then as I look to my right, as he starts making his way up into the stands, I mean, I'm just slack-jawed. I'm like, there's no way this is happening. And, it feels like an eternity that he was running up there and doing that stuff. But when I look back on it, in real time, it was like maybe a matter of maybe 5-10 seconds it took him to get from sitting in front of his bench to running up into the stands, beating the crap out of a fan. It was the most unbelievable night I've ever had in the business. I didn't get home till maybe 5 o'clock that morning, because looking at different videos to see who was involved and really, just kind of being able to not only see what happened, in retrospect, but also doing interviews, writing stories, trying to get as many facts as I could, because again, at that point, it was very sketchy as to how all this was going to play out. We knew players were going to be hit with significant suspensions, but it was, again, there's nothing else that we have experienced in the NBA landscape that can compare to that night. Nothing.
Yeah. So after I guess how was covering. I mean, there were a lot of characters on that team: Rasheed Wallace, Ben Wallace, Chauncey, Rip Hamilton, Prince. I mean, Darko. How was how was that? The expectations with Darko and things like that.
Well, let me start with Darko. At the time of that particular year, it was 2003. The Pistons were in the Eastern Conference Finals when they did the lottery drawing to see the order of drafting players. And so we're up in New York City at a practice. The Pistons were playing the Nets that year. And so we're in New York City, we're at a practice, and I'm sitting there and I'm talking with Joe Dumars, who was the GM at the time. And, we're just, making small talk. And then this agent comes in. His name's Mark Kornstein. Good guy. Love Mark. Mark comes in. They make small, we're just kind of having just a real just informal conversation. And then at one point, I walk away and then I see Joe and Mark talking. And then Joe goes over into this other gym that's away from where we are. And so I reach out to him later on to say, hey, what happened? And he said, went over there to see this kid Darko work out. And Joe said, great kid. He's like, but, we have no shot at him because, the only way we would have a shot at him was if we had like the number 2 pick. And so at that point, the Celtics, the Pistons, they were getting a pick from the Memphis Grizzlies. And so that pick was supposed to be like top 5, but no one expected to be number 2.
Yeah.
So lottery drawing happens. Memphis gets the number 2 pick.
Yeah.
That was the best that the Pistons could have done because the pick was number 1 protected. So the only way they would not have gotten that pick was if it was a number 1 overall pick. So they literally maxed out the value of that pick by getting the number 2 pick. And so, being a Syracuse guy, I'm thinking, oh, well, Darko had a great workout, but Carmelo Anthony is the second best player in this draft to LeBron James. So they're going to take Carmelo.
Yeah.
And I got a strong sense that night, and I wrote about that night that Darko Milicic is the likely number 2 pick for the Pistons.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of head scratching. A lot of people were like, "Oh, are you sure about this?" And here's the thing about Darko. He's not a bad dude, first of all. And I think that was the reputation that he built just because of some of the stuff he did off the court. But the problem for Darko was that he walked into the absolute worst scenario for an international player who didn't play a ton internationally, who's, frankly, you're not just playing with a team of pretty good players. You're playing with a front line that was loaded.
Yeah.
Ben Wallace, Rasheed Wallace, Antonio McDyess. Best case scenario for you would be the number 4 big. And at that point, Larry Brown really didn't like to deviate past 3.
Yeah.
So Darko was in a lose-lose situation. And the other thing, too, was that when he did get a chance to play, he didn't play well. Yeah. And he was always put in situations where he was kind of like the human victory cigar. Pistons are up by 25, 3 minutes left to play. Hey, checking into the game is Darko. That doesn't really develop guys to be players. So Darko, not a good fit. The rest of the guys, I can just tell you, I mean, Rasheed Wallace is the guy that a lot of people, when they talk about Detroit Pistons and characters, he's the guy that comes to mind. And I can just tell you right now, Rasheed Wallace was one of my favorite people to cover. And here's why. Yeah. You always knew where you stood with him. If he didn't want to talk, he was not going to put you and him through some of the, what I like to call the interview logistics and gymnastics that some players do, where they just do it just to say they've done it. They're not giving you anything of substance. Yep. Rasheed was not about wasting his time or yours. And I've always respected that. And the other thing, too, about him was that he was one of the most intelligent players I've ever covered. He has a much wider range of interests than I think a lot of people realize. Him and I went to lunch one day in Detroit, and like about halfway through the walk to lunch, he asked me, what was the last good book you read? And of all the questions that I knew he was going to ask me, I thought he would ask me, that was not on the list.
Yeah.
And so we talked about that a little bit. And so then, I'm going to play this game because I like this game he's playing. What was the last book you read? And he spent like about the next 15, 20 minutes talking about he was nearing the end of a book about Genghis Khan.
Wow.
Yes, that was my first. That was the first word that came to mind when he said that. Wow.
Yeah.
And we would have subsequent conversations about NASCAR, with politics, just the type of things that you don't necessarily associate with him when you think about Rasheed Wallace. And so I thought that was really refreshing. And again, it reminded me that, sometimes all you need is a change of scenery to see, I think, get a true, more real perspective on how people are. I mean, that was one. I mean, and I wrote a story about that, and it was one of my favorite stories all time because, it's great when you're a reporter and you're interviewing a subject that you think that all of a sudden you realize, oh crap, there's this other side of them that's way cooler than anything that I know. Yeah. Let me talk about that. Let me write about that. Yeah. Rasheed Wallace, great guy. Chauncey Billups, one of my all-time favorites. And Chauncey did something that I would strongly recommend every NBA player do. Chauncey, after games, and just to give people a little bit of perspective here, after a game is over, there's like a 10, 15-minute cooling off period before the media enters locker room so players can kind of gather their thoughts, shower, talk among themselves, go through that before the media comes into the locker room. Yeah. And so what Chauncey Billups did in Detroit, he would tell you as soon as the locker room opened, he's ready to talk. And for reporters on deadline, that's awesome. Yeah. To get a guy that played, whether he played good or bad, doesn't matter. Chauncey was always ready to go as soon as the locker room opened. Yeah. Most players, they'll mingle after it opens. They'll talk amongst themselves. They will take a nice gingerly shower, maybe get a massage or some type of treatment before they talk to the media. And that's why a lot of times you won't see comments coming from certain players until like an hour and a half after a game. Because we're waiting for them to kind of go through all the stuff that they go through after games. But Chauncey dealt with us immediately, and his thinking was real simple. The sooner I deal with you, the sooner I'm done with you. And that wasn't a disrespect thing. Yeah, his thing was, I just want to play the game, give you guys what you need, and get out of here to my family, my friends, and just keep it moving like that. And I always appreciate that about Chauncey. He's a Hall of Fame interview with me for life because he made my job in that respect so much easier and made the lives of a lot of reporters, for that matter, easier. So
that's awesome. You covered Flip Saunders a little bit, maybe?
Yeah.
How was that like?
It's interesting. Flip walked into, I thought, just an absolute incredibly difficult situation. For those who don't know it, Flip Saunders, he's no longer with us. He passed away. I think it's been maybe a year or so ago. Yeah. The thing about Flip, excellent offensive mind. I mean, I remember before he came to Detroit, and I would be on press row, and sometimes you're surrounded by scouts, and scouts are watching these games. They're taking notes. They're jotting down plays that they're seeing the other teams do. And I remember, some of the comments that they would make with some of the Flip stuff that Flip was running, and it was confusing to them. Because Flip had this way of making the slightest wrinkle with his plays that looks kind of like what you thought it was supposed to be, but not quite what you thought. And so it creates an element of confusion, not only for scouts, but obviously for guys on the floor who are trying to stop and trying to defend his players and his plays. And so I thought it was a good move for the Pistons to bring in Flip Saunders because he was such a strong offensive guy. But you're replacing a living legend in Larry Brown. Yeah. You're replacing a guy who won a title in Detroit with a team that on paper was one of the biggest underdogs to ever win an NBA title. I mean, they beat a team with Shaq, Kobe, Karl Malone, Gary Payton. And even if those guys were in the end of their careers, they were still pretty good players. Yeah. And so for them to win that series says a lot. But Flip, I liked Flip as a person a lot. But I thought, one, he walked into a tough situation because he had a bunch of veterans who had won at the highest level without him.
Yeah.
Two, the way Flip had a very easygoing, laid-back demeanor, and they were used to Larry Brown, who was a bit more of a tactician, more overbearing, more just a more of a bad cop, more of a bad cop than good cop. Yeah. And so I thought that created some problems. I thought that Flip had a tough time getting those guys to respect him the way I think they should have respected him. Yeah. And it ultimately impacted them when it mattered most in the playoffs. Yeah. But Flip, as a coach, one of the best offensive minds I've ever been around. As a person, one of the best people that you could be around. I still have voicemail messages from Flip Saunders, on my phone. That even before his illness, and he ultimately passed away. Yeah. I still would listen to from time to time, only because Flip was just really good about just insight. Yeah. He knew how to read people. He knew. He was just a good guy, and I have a similar feel for Jerry Sloan, who recently passed away. Yeah. A guy that, I remember the first time I met Jerry Sloan. I'm sitting in a media room, and I'm just trying to wolf some food down before I got to go do interviews and stuff. Yeah. And I hear this voice behind me. It says, anyone sitting here? And I look back, it is Jerry Sloan. I'm just like, wait a minute. This is way too cool. And he sits down and we talk about basketball, obviously. We talk family. We talk about his days in Chicago. And we do this, while just, smacking down food. And I'm totally forgetting that I got to go and do some interviews. And he, he's got to get back into his locker room and prepare his guys for the game. Yeah. And he was just that kind of coach. And if you talk to folks in the NBA, there's a generation of us who have similar stories about him, just literally walking up to you, pulling up a chair, talking about life. I have my own Mount Rushmore of coaches that I've dealt with throughout my 20 plus years in the NBA, and he's on it because not only in terms of what he did in terms of X's and O's and winning, but the man himself. I mean, it's very rare that coaches will allow themselves to be open enough to where you can see a little more of them than other than what you see on the sidelines. Jerry Sloan was that type of coach. He really allowed, media folks to kind of see him for who he really was. And I'm eternally grateful for that. It helped me, frankly, in how to deal with other coaches down the road, knowing that, what you're dealing with in this massive group setting for interviews, you're probably not going to be dealing with that if you get some alone time with them or some time where it isn't as many people around. And so he provided great perspective for me going forward on how to do my job better.
How did you approach, you see player relationships with media, different based on, how did you approach, creating relationships and, maybe some things were off the record versus on the, because you see, some of the interactions DeMarcus Cousins has with people, this Horace Grant situation coming up with the book and things like that. How did you establish relationships, and how do you still and create a sense of trust with the players?
Well, I would say that it's a lot harder to do that now than it was when I first started off because, when I began covering the NBA, you didn't have social media. Yeah. You didn't have players necessarily looking to expand their brand as much, other than shoe deal. I mean, that was pretty much their thoughts when it came to expanding their brand. I want to get a shoe deal. Yep. And so that doesn't really impact the relationships that you can develop and cultivate with media. The one thing that I tried to do early on was just to see if we've got something in common, to see if there's and something in common that goes beyond basketball. I mean, I'll just give you an example. Chauncey Billups, his wife was pregnant with his first child, the same time my wife was pregnant with my first child. Wow. And, we both, we had lots of conversations about like what that's going to be like, first time fathers. Yeah. And we both were, kind of hoping that we both would have boys. For once, I beat Billups. I got a boy and he wanted with a girl. But he's got two girls and they're awesome. Yeah. That was part of the foundation of our relationship. And we've had numerous conversations since then, and we still, talk from time to time now. And so that's one type of relationship. Me and Rip Hamilton, I went to Syracuse, he went to UConn. Let's just say there were a number of side bets made between those two teams when they played. And we would joke about that, and we kind of connected that way.
Yep.
And so to me, that's ultimately what you're trying to do. You're just trying to find that space where you can have frank conversations and it not be awkward. It's tougher to do that now because, first of all, there's greater access to players by the media. And so you don't get as many opportunities to get that quality alone time or small group time as you used to. The other issue is that, and I touched on this earlier, I know with Twitter, Instagram, all that stuff, players have a way of connecting with fans in a way that they didn't before. And there's a segment of them that don't necessarily benefit as much as earlier generations of players from that relationship with the media. So you're fighting that battle as well. And then the other, again, the elephant in the room is that, players, frankly, their attitude is just different. There's much more. It's more about me than the game or how to expand the game or how to frankly draw in more people. Because as great as their IG followings may be, people still want to hear from someone who's not in their pocket. I mean, if I'm getting an IG post from player X and he's posting that, it's going to be kind of like the Last Dance documentary. The star of that post is going to look really good. So I think that there is a definite need for more impartiality when it comes to, the way players are portrayed. But, today what I'm finding now is that ultimately it just comes down to comfort level. I think what happens, you've got a lot of people in the media covering teams who just aren't comfortable around these players, and players sense that. And that's, I look at a guy like Marcus Smart, for example. He's one of my favorite players. And, people ask me, how did that relationship with Marcus start? And I say, well, Marcus was doing a camp up in Maine shortly after he got drafted, and there was not a single other media person there but me. And I just remember him and I sat down, and then it was the first time he had a chance to talk to me, and I talked to him, and I kind of laid out to him how I cover athletes and how I cover teams, and I kind of basically made my case why you and I can work together. And he's been a great guy to cover. I do consider him a friend, and you can be friendly with players. That doesn't mean you won't criticize him, because let me tell you, Marcus goes 3 for 17. I will write and say he had a crappy game, because he did. And to me, I tell people it's a lot easier to be critical of guys who are you're friendly with, because they know that you're not coming down on them because you don't like them. You're coming down on them because this is what they did. This is what they did what they did not do. So it's hard to develop those relationships because, again, you don't necessarily get that kind of one-on-one time. But when the opportunity presents itself, I mean, I've really gone out of my way to make the most of it. That's why, when Terry Rozier, before he became Scary Terry, him and I had lots of conversations. When he was on, playing summer league, and everyone is talking about the top 5 guys, I'm sitting there talking to Terry Rozier about this, that, and the other. When Isaiah Thomas shows up, and folks didn't realize he was going to be there, and I did. So I pulled him aside, and he gave me the greatest line, the line that kept giving, the Brinks truck line. So that was when he said that. I knew as soon as he said that, I'm like, this is going to be part of the Isaiah Thomas narrative forever. And so again, you have to develop relationships and have a rapport, and you don't have to be their BFFs, but you do have to be on friendly terms with these players if you want to have an opportunity to generate content that goes beyond the group, setting type stuff.
You don't need to name any players, but has there ever been a point where, you've written an article or something like that, maybe a little bit critical, and one of them has reached out and lashed out at you or anything like that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know there's no way that you could have been doing what I do for as long as I've done it and not upset someone along the way. There was a player many years ago who took offense to a story I wrote right before a West Coast trip, where basically I said if they could win, it was like a 5 or 6 game trip, and I wrote something to the effect that if they can come out of this with 2 wins, they should be feeling good about themselves.
Yeah.
And he took offense to that.
Yeah.
And the way he went about taking offense to it was a little bit different. I was in the middle of a conversation with one of his teammates, and he walked by, and I said hi, and he just kind of grunted.
Yeah.
And I said, well, if you got something to say, speak.
Yeah.
And he said, I do. And I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And so make a long story short, we went into another area and just had like a 10-minute conversation. And it was a great conversation.
Yeah.
He laid out his issues with what I wrote. I laid out why I wrote that. We both came away agreeing to disagree, but we both had mutual respect for each other because I told him this at the time. I appreciate you speaking to me about this as opposed to letting it vent and taking it out on some other person in the media or your teammates or just letting it fester because it doesn't have to.
Yeah.
And he appreciated that I was willing to hear him out and that I wasn't going to judge him. And it wasn't, in fact, it made our relationship better to the point where, I mean, you know, for a number of years, we did the whole Christmas card swap thing and everything.
Wow. Yeah.
So I do think sometimes those type of moments, I look at it kind of like you've got a piece of coal, and then all of a sudden you've got to put some pressure on it. And when coal is under pressure, the gem it becomes is a beautiful thing. And that player is a friend of mine. He's a former player now, but he's someone that I've spoken to many times through the years. You know, I send him a birthday shout out every year. His birthday, he reaches out to me out of the blue sometimes just to say hi.
Yeah.
And there's no way we would have developed that if we didn't have that one issue back in the day to work through. So I think that generation of players, guys who played in the 90s and early 2000s, I think they're just cut from a different kind of cloth.
Yeah.
If you approach them with what I consider mutual respect for their thoughts, their ideas, and just how they are. I don't think that players today are as open-minded. And part of that has to do because they've got more stuff cluttering in their minds.
Yeah.
Again, social media to me, it's a double-edged sword. I think there's a lot of positives without question for players, but there's a lot of negatives too. And we tend to harp on the negatives more than the positives. And I get that. But for players, I just think it's a hard path to figure out what's the right route when you're talking about social media. Am I tweeting too much? Am I tweeting too little? Am I posting too much? Am I giving people TMI on my IG, or am I just, really trying to bring them in? It's tough for players. It really is.
So we were talking a little bit about it, but it's 2008, 2009, Detroit, the U.S. is going through a recession. And at the time, it was probably called Fox Sports Network. I'm not, maybe.
Down in Michigan, yeah. Are you talking about in Boston?
Boston. Was it FSN back then, or was it CSN-NE?
No, they were. I believe you're right. I think they're either Fox or Prism Sports or something. But there was a different name, yeah.
And so they reached out from Boston. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, yeah. What happened? They were interested in filling the position, or creating the position, I should say. They were looking to bring in a bunch of insiders, and a friend of mine had recommended me to them. And the way it worked is this. And this is when we were talking earlier about how, you really have to keep an open mind because the path that you pivot to may not be the path that you ever saw coming.
Yeah.
Years ago, the Celtics and the Pistons played in the playoffs. And at the time, what is now NBC Sports Boston, then they reached, that's probably the easiest way to explain it. They were looking to have someone in the Detroit market to be on their pregame show to talk about the Pistons. And I went on their show, and I did it a couple more times during the playoff series for them, and I didn't really think much of it. Fast forward to 2009, and they're looking to fill this position, and a friend recommended me to them, and there were a couple people, they're like, wait a minute, that name sounds familiar. And so they did a little search, and they realized that they already had a video of me working with their people. So that made them feel comfortable about the TV side of things, which is important because, this was a multimedia platform type job that they were looking to fill. And so TV, it's the one unknown when you're looking at print reporters to bring in. How are they going to be on TV? Well, they knew how I was. So then it just became a matter of, okay, what's he like as a reporter? And so I sent them some of my work. And I guess the best way to explain it was that we made initial contact on like a Wednesday. I gave them more stuff on Thursday. We set up a time for me to come in. The following Tuesday, they offered me the job on the spot that Tuesday. And so within less than a week, I went from Pistons beat writer in Live to Celtics Insider, at the time CSNE.com, now NBC Sports Boston. So it was a very quick whirlwind romance. That's now more than a decade into it. So again, it's one of the reasons why I tell people all the time, do not limit yourself when it comes to journalism, when it comes to being in the business. Because, the very reason I left North Carolina to Michigan was because I thought that they were on to something. I thought that they saw the future of this business and were actively, aggressively putting forth the kind of footprints, if you will, along those lines. Same concept with coming to Boston. I thought the fact that they were looking for people who could write, who could report, who could do on air. They were looking for a jack of all trades. And that's really, that appealed to me because I thought that had tremendous value for our industry going forward. And the fact that I'm joining someone who's just getting that started, I can help them as they put their footprints in this particular field of our business. And again, the point I made earlier about David Aldrich, I mean, he was the blueprint for me on how to make that pivot from Michigan to Boston, knowing that he was a longtime reporter at the Washington Post. He's done sideline work for Turner. He's been an insider for ESPN. He was doing what I was being tasked to do on a much larger scale. And so there are lessons that I, without question, tried to adapt from how he did things.
How was the Boston culture at that time? I mean, the Celtics were still relevant. How was Doc? How was KG? How was, you're going from a team that had gone to the conference finals 6 years in a row, and you're still going to a team that won an NBA championship the year before. So high stakes.
Well, when I left Detroit, they were clearly on a decline. Like my last year there, I believe they got knocked out in the first round of the playoffs. And they weren't supposed to do much, when I left that year. So my timing was really good in that regard. I go to Boston, and one of the first people there was Rasheed Wallace. And, the joke at the time was that, Rasheed didn't sign with Boston. It was actually a trade where Boston got Rasheed and a beat writer to be named later, me. And so it was really good at first because, the people you mentioned, Doc, KG, Paul, I'd known those guys after just covering the league for so long. Doc in particular, I knew from his days in Orlando. Because when he was in Orlando, he had Ben Wallace there. And I just working on Ben Wallace stories, I'd reached out to Doc, and he'd been gracious with his time. And I realized was an amazing talker and an amazing motivator. And so a chance to cover him on a day in, day out basis, I really was looking forward to. And, KG, one of the wildest moments in my journalism career happened with KG before I got to Boston. When I was in Detroit, and I'll pivot out of this back to Paul, but when I was in Detroit, there was a player named Joe Smith, who got into a little bit of there was a little bit of drama when he was in Minnesota that made him a free agent. And he wound up playing in Detroit one year. The following year, he went back to Minnesota. And so when Detroit and Minnesota were about to play each other first time, obviously we want to talk to Joe before the game. And so we're in Minnesota locker room, and there's like three of us that are full-time traveling beat writers. There's three of us, and we're waiting to talk to Joe. And Kevin comes in, and he just walks past us and says, "Hey, guys, I'll be with you in a second." And we're like, "Oh, okay. Top 5 player wants to talk to us without us requesting to talk to him." We are all about that. And so Joe was in the back getting treatments, and Kevin came back out, and he just sat down and said, okay, I'm ready. And we were like, this is the Peyton Manning Omaha call. We are audibling to something completely different, completely unscripted. And Kevin talked to us for like maybe 10, 15 minutes about everything under the sun, about just the relationship between him and Joe, his passion for the game. It was the most amazing pre-Twitter, pre-Instagram moment, because it was a kind of conversation that it showed me a side of KG that I never saw before or after that.
Yeah.
And it just, so as much as people try to lock in on the, some of the crazy stuff that KG does, because some of the stuff he does is crazy.
Yeah.
I'm always going to hold on to that moment where he just randomly wanted to talk, and he delivered some absolute gems about, just his approach to basketball. And it was one of those things where all of us felt like, if I'm his teammate, oh, hell yeah, we're winning.
Yeah.
Let's go right now.
Yep.
I mean, Kevin was the ultimate motivator.
Yep.
And I did not realize the extent of how just how much he could move the needle in terms of getting you from a mental standpoint to a place that you're not at.
Yeah.
I thought that was one of the great gifts that he had as a player, his ability as a motivator and a leader. And again, you saw that play out in Boston. We talk a lot about how that culture changed. It's not a coincidence that culture shift back to them being an elite, great, standard-bearing franchise came about when Kevin Garnett got there.
Yeah. And I guess what has been, in general, what's been like your favorite Celtic you've met? I mean, have you interacted with Bill Russell? I know you've obviously interacted with Tommy Heinsohn and Mike Gorman, two legends in the game. What has the storied nature of Boston given you a different experience than, say, Detroit?
It has, and it is different. I mean, from a historical, big picture perspective, Boston is on a different plane than really. I think the only franchise that is even close is the Lakers.
Yeah.
In terms of just long-term historical greatness, not only the players, but also just moments in time. I look at the Celtics. They had the first black starting five in NBA history. They had the first black head coach in NBA history. They had the first black player drafted in NBA history. They've done a lot of historical things that set them apart from a lot of franchises, even though the city's reputation contradicts a lot of what they have done from an accomplishment standpoint. I get that. But when I think about folks that I've dealt with that really kind of resonate, there's a few that come to mind. I mean, Tommy Heinsohn, obviously. I see Tommy all the time, and I don't take those times for granted. Even though I grew up in Syracuse, I'm originally from New Jersey, and Tommy's from New Jersey, and Tommy is more Jersey than people realize if you really got a chance to sit down and talk with him, which I love to do.
Yeah.
If the cameras pan on the court before games, it's not unusual to see Tommy and I just sitting there laughing, talking about anything and everything, because there's that man has forgotten more stories, great stories, than I will ever know.
Yeah.
And I try to tap into his knowledge bank as often as I can.
Yeah.
Satch Sanders is another guy that I spend, I don't talk to him as much as I wish I did. But I do think about Satch, and really think about what he's meant to this organization a lot. So he's another one. Bob Cousy. I've done some sit downs with Cousy at his place up in Worcester, and love Coos. Love Coos. He's a funny guy. Great sense of humor. Great player. Has a great perspective on history. And that's another one that I think of. And there's a handful of other guys. Haven't spent a ton of time with Russell. If you notice, he
doesn't associate.
Isn't exactly. He's not the warm fuzzy type with most people. So, but that's okay. I mean, his record as a player, his record as an activist, his record as just a humanitarian, it speaks for itself, and he's great. You don't have to be a BFF of the media to be viewed as a great person or individual in the media. I certainly see him as a great one, even though my interaction with him has been somewhat limited. But there's a lot of history with these guys. A lot of history.
Talk a little bit about your relationship with Danny Ainge. Obviously, he knows, what NBC Sports Boston's role is, and trying to cover every rumor in the mill. And over the last 11, 12 years, I mean, there's been a lot that has gone on. How is his relationship with maybe you and CSNNE or NBC Sports Boston and things like that?
I think it's solid. I mean, we're doing things with him that he's not doing with anyone else.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of different series that involve him and Brad Stevens, and it's given us some unique content at a time when there's just not a lot of creative content to go around, particularly involving folks within their organization. So I would say his relationship with our company is good.
Yeah.
Him and we have a solid relationship. I mean, I would not say that we're like BFFs, but we're not arch enemies. I mean, he's not texting me or calling me, cussing me out, and I'm not, down his throat about this, that, and the other. He understands that I have a job to do, and I understand he does as well.
Yeah.
And we try to respect that relationship as best we can. Now, are there going to be times where we have differences? Absolutely. There's no absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think in the grand scheme of things, we're probably more aligned than we are not. And that's what you want. I mean, it's a very different relationship with Danny than, let's say, when I was in Detroit and I dealt with Joe Dumars.
Yeah.
Part because, the one similarity is that they both were former players for those respective organizations. And so that gave them a perspective on a lot of subjects and topics that was a great benefit to me. Yeah. But obviously, Detroit doesn't have quite the same kind of history as Boston does.
Yeah.
And so the conversations that tend to delve into a historical lane, it's a much deeper dive with the Celtics than it was Detroit for obvious reasons. But Danny and I, no issues.
Good. No, that's
which is
good.
Great.
Yeah. So I want to talk about a little bit about. So obviously, for younger people that are entering the journalism business, they look at you as someone who's made it. And so what is your advice to them on, maybe some key lessons or some key things to remember as they go through their journey to maybe getting to the point where you are?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that you have to, and I say this all the time, and I'll explain it a little bit more in detail in a second, but you have to learn at an early point of your career to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. Yeah. And by that, I simply mean this. You have to understand that whatever blueprint you think you have for how your career is going to go and progress and what's going to happen, know that you are going to more likely than not have to pivot away from that and potentially pivot in directions that that aren't your strong suit, that aren't in your wheelhouse, that may force you to, frankly, take a step or two back in order to take 2, 3, 4 steps forward down the road. Yeah. That's something that, you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Yeah. I just remember when I was in college and I was a columnist, I'm writing my opinion every single day. Yeah. And then I get to, full-time status, and I'm in the middle of a town of 500 people writing about blacksmithing, which I knew nothing about.
Yeah.
And, I've got a choice. I can either, 1, sulk about it, 2, suck it up and deal with it, and just try to deal with it. Or I could just make this the most amazing, awesome blacksmithing story that has ever been written.
Yeah. And
I choose door number 3, because I think whenever you're tasked with doing something, your mindset should be on trying to be the best version of yourself that you can be. And for me, in my mindset, the best version of me is being amazingly awesome. Yeah. And do I fall short? Absolutely. But that doesn't mean the focus wasn't there. And that, to me, is one of the things that I again, learning to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, knowing that the end road isn't necessarily in front of you, but it might be a few in front of you, if that makes sense. Yeah. And also, don't sell yourself short. just because you're tasked with something that's difficult doesn't mean that the end result is going to be difficult or disappointing.
Yeah.
I've just had so many examples in my career where I was tasked with doing something that I either one knew very little about, like blacksmithing,
Yeah.
or two, I knew a little bit about, but I didn't think I was very good at it. But someone saw something in me that said, "Hey, you're our guy." And I'll just give you maybe one of my probably the best example I have of this.
Yeah.
As I mentioned earlier, I started off full time working in Syracuse, and I'm just backing up the entire world. I'm back up Syracuse football, back up Syracuse basketball, but I was the main guy on the blacksmithing beat. That was my thing. Okay?
Yeah.
So I'm going through, just going to preseason football, and I'm doing all that stuff that the main guy wasn't doing. And about a week and a half before the season opener, he gets really sick. And I'm thinking like, oh, that kind of sucks. I guess they're going to just, shift someone else over to fill in for this one game.
Yeah.
And my sports editor says, no, you're going to go and cover the first game. And the first game was on the road.
Yeah.
So, and this is, and again, I'm going to show how the dominoes have a way of falling in a way that paints a picture that you never dreamed of. Okay. So I'm assigned to go cover the first game on the road. It's at North Carolina.
Yeah.
Okay. First game. And it's Donovan McNabb's very first game.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm ridiculously nervous, amazingly nervous. And so what I do, I call everyone I know who has ever covered a college football game.
Yeah.
And I get advice. And I'm writing all these notes. And then I'm just trying to think about all this. And then I had a friend that said, dude, relax. You got this.
Yeah.
And he took like my notes and he just threw them on the floor. He's like, you don't need all this. You know what you're doing. And I said, you're right. I do. But I waited till he left and I picked him back and I skimmed him. But he was right. I was definitely overthinking the process, and I was setting myself up for paralysis by analysis, essentially. Yeah. So I tried to relax a little bit more, be a little bit more easygoing about it. And so on the way down to North Carolina, I have to do a radio spot. A radio show reached out to me, wanted to talk about Donovan McNabb. So I'm like, okay, cool. And I had done radio before, so it was no big deal. I do the radio hit, no problem.
Yeah.
A friend of mine worked down there, and he worked at the News and Observer, which is a newspaper down there. So he had to go into the office that day. He takes me along with him because he picked me up from the airport. And the sports editor is in there. I introduced myself. He's like, oh, I heard you on the radio. You're pretty good.
Yeah.
Okay. I go to the game. I cover the game. I head back to Syracuse. 3 months later, that sports editor who heard me on the radio, which was set up by me going to North Carolina, which was set up by me being told I was going there by my sports editor.
Yeah.
He offered me a job.
Wow.
Covering the ACC.
Yeah.
3 or 4 months later.
Yeah.
And that's what I did.
Yeah.
And so again, you have to be ready to pivot. And you have to take advantage of every opportunity, because if I did a crappy job on that radio hit, he may not have offered me that job.
Yeah. Wow.
But I had no idea that radio hit might potentially get me a job down the road. And that's how you have to approach everything you do as a young journalist. You have to assume that this is part of my wall of success. This is one of the blocks that I have to start stacking up to create my wall for success. Yeah. And that's kind of how I look at stuff, because every job I've had, there has been a moment that was triggered that I wasn't looking necessarily to trigger this new job. Yeah. That radio hit triggered the sports editor hiring me in North Carolina. Those TV hits that I did when Boston played Detroit, I had no idea that those would be part of what they used to justify or part of the decision in hiring me to come to Boston. Yeah. So I think everything you do counts. Everything matters, man. Everything you do in some way, shape, or form matters, because to me, life is the movie where there is no trailer, there is no pause, there's no 20-second timeout. It's always rolling. Yeah. And whether you realize it or not, someone's always watching you.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. What's the most rewarding thing about being in the industry? What gives you happiness about being, obviously you've had different roles in terms of, writing online, writing a newspaper, being a TV, analyst. what's been the most rewarding part about all this?
Oh goodness, I would say the well, actually, I've got two things. I mean, I would say just some of the relationships that I've built over the years. I mentioned earlier guys like Chauncey Billups, Rip Hamilton, Rasheed Wallace, Paul Pierce, who I love chatting with Paul Pierce now because this guy was not the most friendly guy to the media when he played, and now he's on the team.
Yep.
Which I remind him of from time to time. But I love Paul. I think he does exactly what you're supposed to do: get people talking.
Yep.
I don't agree with a lot of stuff he says, but it does provoke thought, and that's part of what I think his charm and allure is as a broadcaster now. But the relationships, I would say, is one of the big things that I like. The fact that there's a lot of players that if I run across them in the street, we can strike up a conversation. Rip Hamilton does, some TV stuff, and every time we're in the same building, he makes a point of reaching out to me just to say hi, and we just chop it up right there. Some of my friends, they tease me about that because just like, man, you and that Pistons championship team, you guys are like brothers. In a lot of ways, we are.
Yeah.
Because, they knew that so many people did not anticipate them winning that title, including myself. And so I take a lot of joy in seeing how they have been able to transition away from that and are all, for the most part, doing a lot of really good things. But the other thing I would say that has been for me really big is just the travel.
Yeah.
I never gave it any thought when I got into the business that this job would open up so many opportunities to see parts of the world that I never would have imagined. I mean, I had the benefit when I was undergrad at Syracuse of spending a semester abroad. Yeah. And so I studied in London, and I had a chance to go to Spain, Germany, Belgium, France, lots of different places in Europe. Yeah. And I thought at the time that, well, it's great to do this when I'm young because I may never get this opportunity to do it again. Yeah. And then fast forward, I'm interviewing David Stern in Italy. Yeah. I'm following Paul Pierce around, Paris or Germany, wherever we were, where fans are flocking to him, and I'm videotaping this. And it's, there's parts of the world that I thought I would never either see again or see at all. Yeah. That the job has afforded me that luxury, and even on a more domestic scale, going to Sacramento, which I've got a love-hate relationship with that city. It's a long story, but just seeing different parts of the NBA landscape, and also just some of the the relationships that those travels have been able to bring about. It's made this job a lot more rewarding than I think a lot of other potential career choices. Because even though, I may have came up with the most awesome flavor ever invented if I were a chemical engineer, I don't know if that would top, being, in Belgium or, being in Germany, or like I said, like sitting down talking with the NBA commissioner on international soil. Yeah.
You mentioned David Stern. I didn't ask, do you have any good stories about Stern or Kobe Bryant?
Oh goodness. Let's see. Stern. No, I mean, that the interview I had with him was great, and it was the video is still out there and it can be accessed, but what's not on the video is the conversation we had before. Yeah. And David, listen, I've been around players my entire life. I mean, I went to high school with a guy who played in the NFL, was all pro. I've been seeing big name folks all the way back to when I was 12, 13 years old. So there's no real fanboy / starstruck in me. Yeah. Except with David Stern.
Really?
Because I just have so much respect for what he has done for the league. Yeah. And just when I think about where the league was when he took over, where he positioned the league when he walked away, and to have this sit down with him, there was some, without question, it was the most nervous I'd have ever been for an interview. And I just remember beforehand, he just kind of, he just said, it's going to be okay.
Yeah,
it's gonna be okay. Because he could totally tell that, I was definitely not myself. Yeah. And for me, that was really, really, really reassuring. Yeah. And with Kobe, there wasn't any particular moment with him. It was every moment.
Yeah.
Every time he spoke, I mean, it was like that old E.F. Hutton commercial. People listen. When
Yeah.
Kobe speaks, people listen.
Yeah.
And I thought it was so unusual that he had that presence. But then you listen to him talk. There was a maturity about him as far as how he carried himself that was always present. And, to me, it's one of those things where there are very few people who have things that happen to them in their lives that you will never forget where you were in that moment.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I remember exactly where I was when I got the news that Kobe Bryant was killed, had died.
Yeah.
And it was painful because I think my reaction initially was like a lot of people, and like, this has got to be a hoax. This is a really, really bad joke. It's not funny.
Yeah.
And within like an hour, I'd reached out to some folks I know out in LA and some folks, who are part of the Kobe camp, and they were trying to get it verified, but they were being told the same thing. And it became very real. And that, Kobe was Kobe was unlike any athlete I've been around.
Yeah.
Rip Hamilton, as I mentioned earlier, him and Kobe really tight, both from PA. Had gone to a lot of camps together. You can find videos of them when they were like, I think it's at the either All-American camp or some type of Nike camp or something where, they're just kind of hanging around, being buddies. And I know Rip, he took it hard. And I know a lot of guys took it hard because, again, their initial reaction was, this isn't real. This isn't true. Not Kobe, not now, not him. I don't have a definitive Kobe story because to me, there is no Kobe moment. The Kobe narrative is the story with him. So,
what's the best atmosphere game that you've ever been in attendance for?
Best atmosphere. I would say probably any of the home games during the Pistons 2004 championship run against the Lakers. It was unbelievable. I mean, I just remember it being so loud that for the first time ever, I couldn't even hear my thoughts. Like usually when it's really loud, you just kind of go to your own thoughts and then you kind of process things that way. It was literally like I'm trying to have a conversation in my head and I couldn't. So fortunately, I had some earplugs. And they allowed me to have a conversation in my head. I still, the noise was so deafening. Without them, I couldn't hear anything. With them, I could hear my thoughts, barely. That was the most amazing crowd I had ever seen for a game. And that's when Detroit basketball was a really big thing. There have been some really good crowds in Boston. And I think one of the challenges for Boston, one of the challenges for the Celtics, though, is that because the bar is so insanely high for their crowds and their crowd engagement, it's hard to pinpoint that one game or that one playoff series that was just so extraordinarily unique from an atmosphere standpoint. But the deeper they get into the playoffs, that's when it really gets interesting. But I will say this, the game that I think may rival an NBA Finals game will be when the Celtics play the Brooklyn Nets and Kyrie Irving shows up in the building. That game is going to be bananas. For Kyrie's sake, it would be wise if that game happens and there's limited fans. Because if we're able to get back to how things normally are for games, that's the one that it will be bananas.
And then, as you mentioned, talk about what the COVID-19 situation has been on journalism, and obviously, this is the NBA is trying to get back. We'll see. They'll hopefully release something June 1st. What has it been like for you? Because it's just it's a once in 100-year event. How has it been for the business?
Okay, well, I can speak for the businesses as a whole when I say this. It's kind of sucked. It has not been good for business at all. Well, let me clarify. When you look at, I think, New England and our market and NBC Boston specifically, obviously with Tom Brady going to Tampa Bay, that has been a significant spike for, our, content without question. But, it's been a different kind of challenge trying to deliver content that resonates with folks at a time when there are no games to be played. You have to really put on your big boy thinking pants and your creative hat and just go at it. One of the things that I try to do, and a lot of people are trying to do this, is, you lean on history and you're showing classic games, you're showing classic moments, you're doing a lot of things that are more retrospective, looking back where things used to be, looking at trends from the past. That's certainly what you're trying to do. One of the things that I've also found myself doing more of is just leaning on all the years of experience and the sources that I've developed over the years. I can't necessarily get Jason Tatum on my podcast, but I can get Donnie Wahlberg. I can't, and so you start because I know him, and so that's the one thing that you're trying to do a lot more of now, is really try to give the audience something that they might want. And Wahlberg, I use him as an example because he's a super fan, super fan of the Celtics, and I know that. And in this period of quarantine, him and I have been like literally in some of the same digital spaces, which is funny. We also have, we have a few other things in common as well. And, I also did a podcast, for example, with former NBA official Danny Crawford, who, if you do a Google search, you will find that there's maybe one other interview that he's ever done. And that was because he didn't have a choice. He was being recognized at the United Center in Chicago after he retired. And so there's this, you just can't avoid the media at that point because they're right there. But I had him on my podcast, and he was awesome. He was also one of the three officials in Michael Jordan's last game with the Bulls. So he could have theoretically called that potential push-off on Michael. And we talked about that. That's up on our podcast where he addresses that and he explains why that wasn't called. But those are the kind of things that in this quarantine period, I've been trying to do more of, because again, I can't give you how Jason Tatum is going to fare against Team X because one, we don't know if that game is going to be played, and two, we don't know when any games, for that matter, are going to be played. But I can tell you what the referee in Game 6 of that series was thinking on why he didn't call that push-off, since we're talking about the last stand and all that stuff as a society right now. And so for me, that has really been the goal, is to try to deliver content that folks might actually care about. Because right now, I can't give you games. I can't give you analysis of games being played because there are no games being played. And analysis of games that have already been played, that's a hard sell. I'm trying to convince you that I'm going to break down this game whose outcome and I know. I'm really, really, really stretching for you to buy into that. And I just, I'd rather deliver something that you maybe not necessarily, that you just can't get anywhere else. And that's really what it comes down to, that you can't get anywhere else, and that knowing it's out there, you'll want to consume it.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. Was there anything else that you wanted to talk about?
No, man, you've got the Cliff Notes version of the autobiography right here, man.
Perfect. So I just want to thank you for being on the podcast. You are an amazing figure. Do a great job at NBC Sports Boston. How can people support you and maybe follow you on different sites?
Initially, I'm on social media. My Twitter, IG are both Sherrod Blakely, and that's ASHERROD BLAKELY. I'm on both Twitter and IG, as I mentioned. Our website, NBC Sports Boston. Most of my digital content is there. So definitely, follows always appreciate it. I don't have a GoFundMe campaign, so you can't support me that way. But you know, and whatever you can do to help, you know, our frontline workers, please do that. Give them, whether it's financial, whether it's prayers, whether it's, you know, whatever you can do to help the folks who are really, you know, literally putting their lives on the line to save people on a day in, day out basis. And also, special shout out to the military. Memorial Day is coming up. That's always been a big deal in my family. My father was a 25-year Army vet. My sister was in the Air Force. I have uncles, cousins who've been in the military as well. So I salute you as always, and hope others will do the same as well. So that's all I got.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you again. Appreciate it.
No problem. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too.